So it's a complicated bit, but that listening system, involving employees in the solution rather than putting it on them, is often a better way forward. We find that those feedback loops are really powerful, get you to a better situation and more equitable types of policies and protocols than trying to figure out in a back room and put it out as a policy to the organization.
Hey, this is Aaron Price, the CEO of TechUnited New Jersey, and I am very excited for this episode today where we're talking about post-pandemic return to work and what it means for the real estate market. Excited to have CBRE join us with a few folks. They've got David Opper, the Executive Vice President. We've got Christelle Bron, the Senior Managing Director, and Su-Zette Sparks, also Senior Managing Director. But I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and really talk about what those titles actually mean to your day-to-day job. Maybe David, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. So I sit actually in CBRE's 200 Park office here in Midtown, New York. I do have a partner who sits in New Jersey, who's very much immersed in the New Jersey office market. I run a team that focuses on strategy and finding offices for large corporations and small corporations with a focus on technology-based clients.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. Christelle, what do you actually do?
Thanks for having us.
And by the way, are you may have heard we are TechUnited New Jersey. We like to give David, some jabs for the New York thing. Do you happen to be in New Jersey?
No, I happen to be in Manhattan.
That's okay. It's all right. We like Manhattan. We play well with Manhattan.
You do? So I run the Agile practice for the Americas at CBRE. So what does that mean? I help clients think through how to bring flexibility into their real estate portfolio. So past the 10 or 15-year lease commitment, how do I design a real estate portfolio that is truly adaptable with all the ebbs and flow of the life of a company, and more importantly, of tech company, which we know are hyperscaling, hypergrowing, and how do we help accommodate that? And we work in that respect in implementing it, helping them finding flex space solution. We work Industrious, to name a few, Regis are some of the ones that came to mind, and design a solution around it.
Excellent. Obviously quite applicable in what's going on in the world today. And Su-Zette, nice to have you join us today.
Hi, thanks, Aaron. Su-Zette Sparks. I lead the workplace team at CBRE for the Americas. So that's US, LATAM, and Canada. And we have three specific areas we focus on. One is the workplace experience. So the strategy and how people work in those four walls and beyond is an increasing part of that conversation. Also change management, so how you make that real, and org design. So how you might shift your operating model, your structures in order to help support that way of working going forward.
Awesome. So let's start with what you're seeing in the market now. We're seeing companies, some go back to work full-time in person, others cut back the work week. There's a variety of strategies happening. I'm curious from your point of view, we'll start with you, David, from large corporates, what are you seeing? And how do you see that differ from some of the early stage companies?
Yep, sure. So it's interesting dynamic right now. I think we were speaking earlier about it. So in our area, in the tri-state area, both New York and New Jersey, clearly there's a heavy emphasis on financial services, and there has been traditionally. We see that in Jersey City and the New Jersey waterfront, which helps support a lot of that core industry in New York. The financial service companies, i.e. Goldman Sachs, obviously JP Morgan and so forth, have really dug their heels in and said, look, we want people back in the office, along with Morgan Stanley. And that messaging has been very clear. But as we begin to look at different industry types, it's not as clear. That's one extreme. And it appears that the other extreme tends to be the tech sector, where flexibility is still key. And we haven't seen that same type of corporate digging their heels and saying, you got to be back in the office. And we've actually seen a little bit of large tech companies backing off their initial position to help listen to more of what tenants are saying or what their employees are saying.
And I'm curious, how the flex space, obviously that used to be about a utilization of a certain amount of square feet that was much tighter per person than what was traditionally happening in the corporate environment. How are you seeing that, both the layout inside the flex space change, as well as how corporations, again, small to big, if we can touch on them, utilize those kinds of spaces? Christelle.
So there's a wide spectrum of products that are offered within those flex space. You're probably familiar with the hot desking. You book a seat and then you come into one of those spaces and you sit wherever in an open space available. There was a concept of suites, which still remain fairly dense, right? It's a space that is your private space on a floor plan that you share with others, but that space itself is private. 10, 15 people, 5 people, it depends. There's different size of suites, which is the suites product. And then you have what we call the enterprise product. It's half a floor or a floor fully dedicated to you. You're not sharing the amenities with anyone. And on that space, we've definitely seen a shift with corporation and company asking for level of density. And they're a little lessen compared to the traditional co-working environment. And they're closer to what they would see in their own corporation and enterprise environment. Those are the core products that have always been there. And then with COVID, what we've seen is really a really high adoption of anything that is called on-demand solution. So think access pass to the space. So I don't know where my people are going to work. I don't want to tether them to one office location. So I'm going to give them access to a network of places, right? And they'll have an app and they'll go in the morning, like Uber, right? You go and you book your office and this is where I'm going to go. So those are on-demand services, and those have been exploding. There's a high demand for those because it really responds to that notion as I don't even know where the office should be. I don't know how to do a hub and spoke solution. So the spoke is going to be in some way a virtual spoke. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you think enterprise, the next level is actually the landlord community is actually really embracing those tools. So the Tishman Spires, with their studio products, Heinz, Brookfield, Irvine Company, and I'm going to forget some of them. I'm going to get upset. But the entire industry is really coming together and realizing flexibility is important for our tenants and for our occupiers who are listening to them. And here's a suite of products that are there to answer their questions.
So I want to get back to that because we often talk about, obviously New York City is a major market. And I think there's an opportunity in time for New Jersey to be that spoke. We're seeing some of that happen. But so I want to come back to what the role is for New Jersey and how it could be a complementary opportunity for some of those in New York and vice versa. But Su-Zette, as far as actually the org design that makes people feel comfortable, can you share what you're seeing and especially what you've seen change from what happened pre-pandemic to now?
Well, primarily it's untethering the talent to a physical location. So one of the boons for tech firms, whether you're bootstrapping or you're a little more mature, is you can find your talent anywhere without necessarily needing to relocate that talent. So that's been a huge trend that we've seen across industries, and also hybrid types of working. So I'm in the office sometimes, I'm working in another location, other times, maybe 2 to 3 days a week. And a lot of conversation around how that impacts culture, productivity, the way people are working together. Equity is also a big part of that conversation. But the biggest difference between last year and what we see coming into this year is leader confidence in that work from home, work remote type of policy, really putting a stake in the ground because of concerns of how that might impact specifically the culture and the way people are working and what they're setting out to achieve right on their own horizon. So a lot of that data is active. And I think the biggest takeaway is it's still very much in motion.
Are you finding so much of this stems from the culture of the organization? I'm wondering if you're finding yourselves in positions where people, your clients are leaning on you as far as what the right decision may be, where it's really about the cultural, the organization itself, about whether it allows for a productive work environment. Do they have things like Teams and Slack and a culture that allows for remote work and accepts and celebrates it versus those where, I mean, we're seeing in fintech, David's point before, it's clearly being frowned upon. Goldman is one example, has been very aggressive about getting people back to work. I have friends who are not that thrilled about that. But I'm curious, do you find yourselves in those conversations in a way that I'm assuming you used to be, here's some space, here's some good design, here are great options, here's the data. Now it's, it feels like there's like this psychological element that maybe didn't used to exist before. That's kind of a free for all. I'm getting nods, so whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
For me, that culture is a big driver for those decisions. You can either have a culture by design or default. It's going to happen whether you choose to enable it or not. And so if it's by default, you're making these decisions and you're going to expect the impact. But we see a lot more thoughtfulness in terms of we want to use the opportunity to maintain the culture we have or to make some shifts in the market in the way that we work together. And structure can often drive behavior, which is why you see so many changes in the work environment itself or a hub and spoke model. That structure will inherently shift the behavior of the organization. You just need to understand what that's going to look like and if you've got the appetite to make that sort of change. So it's a huge part of the conversation for us right now. It's in every engagement, on the tip of every client's tongue, and something that definitely have top of mind. And David, Christelle, I'd be interested to hear what you're hearing as well.
Yeah, I would say this, Aaron. I think that as we're talking about that culture, the more time that seems to be going on, what we see is young employees, like the folks living in Hoboken, and Jersey City and in the city, want to get back to the office because they're cooped up in their small apartment. It's really funny how it just comes down to very basic blocking and tackling to some extent. They really want to get back in. The younger folks want to get in. The senior folks want to get people back in for that mentoring. Yeah. And then it's kind of that mid cross section of people who've been there, done that, feel like they kind of get it at this point in their career and don't really, they're the ones that are resisting, and it's kind of nice to work from home. So I mean, that seems to be a trend that I'm seeing certainly in most companies now.
Yeah. And behind the headlines, I mean, there's a lot of headlines in the press that are pretty categorical one way or another, those opinions. Behind closed doors, companies are really thoughtful about this and really trying to balance some things like in financial services, the culture is in person, come to the office, but we've also talent attraction and retention and doing the right thing for their employees and continue to attract and retain them. I think there was a really good HSBC article about that on how they want to tap into this talent. So they're really internally talking between the leadership, HR, and real estate, having a conversation about what's the right balance. And it's interesting because some companies are of the opinion, you know what, I'm not going to know. I'm not going to know for a while. And that's where they come to us with the flexible space. I'm going to test it. I'm going to pilot it. I'm going to get it in the hands of the employees and listen to them and watch what they're doing and learn from this data and learn from this behavior to then adapt. I'm not going to get an answer tomorrow. I don't think any of us really know how we're going to work tomorrow.
Yeah.
We think we do, but I don't think we don't. And I think it's going to be really a game of observing, offering a spectrum of possibility, monitoring it, and then adapting the solution over time based on how, as a nation and as actually the globe is going through this, how we're evolving through it.
So I was on a panel with, I think his title was the managing director of the New Jersey market for Goldman. And we had a heated discussion about how I felt that they were leaving talent behind and not going to attract younger talent who want a certain amount of flexibility. But to your point, there isn't a one size fits all. And it seems that the problem in real estate is there's often the need to sign a long-term lease because you think you know what size fits your needs. So I'm curious from a contractual perspective, how are you now structuring leases and how are you working with your clients to say, well, you may think it's going to be X, but it turns out it might be Y, but now you've got a 20-year lease on something you didn't really want, or vice versa, or you think, or the opposite extreme. How do you actually make these deals happen?
Yeah, it's funny you bring it up. So what we're really seeing, and primarily, let's just focus on, financial or I'm sorry, for tech firms, is a demand by tech firms for built short-term office space. So implied, obviously, the shorter the lease, right? Landlords use longer leases to amortize construction, but in this case, people are really looking and seeking built space, so they don't have to make the long-term decisions. So all of the activity in Manhattan, primarily in the tech space, has all been filled with either short-term subleases or tenants paying real premiums to go into WeWork type opportunities, right, for over a year and a half, so they don't have to make a long-term decision. But we're not seeing those long-term leases taking place right now, at least not in our area within the tech industry.
And what would you recommend if someone, let's start with a large corporation possibility here, and they're considering their midterm, short to midterm real estate needs.
Yep.
And they're not sure where they're going to go. Like, how would you suggest they structure that deal? Like, what's the blend that you would say, okay, well, let's keep let's say you have XYZ 1,000 square feet here. Here's what we're seeing happen. If you're a high growth company, here's where we think you should invest, but here's how to hedge. How does someone right now, when they're uncertain, structure the right deal?
Yeah.
So we're oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Christelle. You can go.
So we're a little bit of data nerds and we let the data lead the solution. So we actually have a patent on our algorithm, but we spend time with them understanding their future growth. So nobody has a crystal ball. We don't pretend we have a crystal ball, but what we're trying to do with them is understand their growth pattern and mainly understand the volatility in that growth and the level of uncertainty it's creating. And from there, we say, well, there's that amount of space. It looks like no matter what, even in the worst case scenario, you're still going to need it. So we can secure this space long-term at a lower rate. And then here's where the volatility goes. And we think about it kind of like an insurance policy, like we're doing actuarials on it. This is the level of volatility. This is on average what you're going to need. This is when you can go extra. And then we put together scenarios that says we can negotiate expansion or contraction option. We can negotiate to insert a flex provider in the stack. And then we compare, we stress test all those solutions against our forecast and the 1,000 ways that the headcount could go. And then it's like Black-Scholes model for the nerds out there. It's Black-Scholes model option pricing, right? And what's the value of that option and that ability to flex? That's why you'll see a lot of, I'm not going to name names, but a lot of the big tech companies that have had hyperscale over the past 5 years, you see them do what I call the lily pad technique. So I'm going to enter a market. I'm going to have 50 salespeople in this market. I'm going to get a flex space. I'm going to double the next 6 months. So I'm going to add to this flex space. And I'm going to continue lily pad until I sign a lease. And I'm going to continue lily pad until I build a tower. And that's,
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. I mean, first of all, obviously that the ability, because everyone's opining on what they think will happen. And it sounds, I appreciate that there's this data-driven approach that will actually help people navigate this as they go, which, I want to make sure we lean into that direction, because as a tech organization, I think people respect that you're leading with the data here. But for someone who, let's lean into the New Jersey, New York market for a moment, because there are companies in our network. Some of them might be relatively small. Maybe they're sub 10 employees, but they might be over 100 in the next, say, 24 months. And in an environment where they're not quite sure what they want to sign on to, I also think there's this, like I talked about this opportunity before, right? 20% of Google's New York City employees, as an example, live in New Jersey. And there's an opportunity, I think, to lean in on the talent pool in New Jersey in general for some of these higher growth tech companies. So how would you work with some of them? And do you have enough data to be able to share with them? Manhattan's relatively condensed. There's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot more supply. The market's entirely different. I'm curious if how you would approach a high growth opportunity where there's a New Jersey, New York symbiotic relationship. Maybe David, I'll start with you.
Yeah.
Or Krista. I know Krista. So we're going to give the floor to David this time.
Yeah, no. Because I totally get it. Because I understand both sides of the river on this thing. So initially, early on, Aaron, in the pandemic, there was a lean on this hub and spoke model that you're describing, where you would have your core office, based in a CBD somewhere. Let's call it New York. And then you would have a local office for easy access for employees to touch down or to sit at those locations. And we did see some examples of that, right? We saw some, but not a lot. It wasn't a wholesale change, at least not to the best of my knowledge, where we've seen this unbelievable change happen where people are really opening these smaller offices in local markets. I remember there were a couple of leases that got done in Short Hills that were tenants based actually downtown in New York, where you had Short Hills residents who said, look, I want to open up the office here short term. We're going to move the business here for now, right? Primarily, we're going to keep the New York office, but we're going to put the C-suite over here for now. but we have not seen this holistically across the board. At least I haven't, where conceptually what you're saying makes a lot of sense. But then companies are just like, well, at that point, maybe I'll just let those people work from home.
Interesting. Su-Zette, I want to lean on the org side of this, because some of the, I imagine some of the things you suggest require significant upfront investment, and others maybe less so. So as people are figuring this out, what do you recommend for them on the talent strategy and the culture strategy?
So it's leading off with the talent strategy and understanding how you want to grow, and then building that environment right to support it. A lot of the conversations right now is on the tactical piece. So what are we giving in terms of equipment, tools, technology, right? How are we going to enable it that way? But then there's an awful lot of attention being paid on the amenities and the way you create equity just in terms of the experience those employees are having, regardless of where they sit. Whether they're sitting in a flex space, in the office, at home, or elsewhere, how are you bridging that gap and reducing the friction with the way people are working together? That's largely with the middle managers. Sometimes a tech startup doesn't have that layer. Everybody's just trying to get the work done. But often in the more mature organizations, those middle managers are going to make or break that strategy, because it's their mental models that are going to make that flexibility successful or not, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. What are you seeing?
Yeah.
I mean, my wife happens to be a chief people officer, so I appreciate where you're coming from here, but she's really opened to my eyes to what many organizations get wrong. And I'm curious, from your perspective, equity means a lot of things to a lot of different people in your industry specifically. So maybe first you could define what does equity mean to you? And then second, what do people get wrong?
Yeah, I actually love the term equity, because it means two different things. On the one hand, it places a value on something. On the other hand, it means fairness, right? So value and fairness on either side of that equation is what you're talking about. And when it comes to people, we inherently get it wrong, because often you're looking for surface solutions that feel good, that don't actually institute change. So there's a lot of conversation, and we're still waiting for some of that action to catch up with a mindset shift that's happening. A few things around that would be, in particular, work from home or working from a flex space is investment in employees, a stipend, helping to supply that equipment for them rather than them doing it out of their own pocket. You'd be surprised how often that does not happen. There's some rules and regulations in different states. New York does not currently have that rule and regulation, but we are seeing an increasing investment in stipends for employees, shifting benefits and amenities, right? So used to, I would come into the workplace as an experience. That's still a big trend. I want to come in and have an experience. I want almost a hospitality, high touch experience. But butt that up with some virtual experiences that everybody can share. Perhaps something that was available to me in the office is now being delivered at home or offered virtually. Rather than building a gym in your high tower office, offer a stipend for health, wellness, right? Give the power to the employee to choose how they're going to spend that money. But the biggest issue in equity, we're actually seeing out of the U.S. Census data, which, depending on where they live, there's socioeconomic and geographical disparities, broadband availability, technology availability. And we know now that a large swath of U.S. citizens, I think it's 80% of Black Americans, 88% of Hispanics, they are living with multi-generational families under one roof. Sharing equipment, sharing space, and lack of privacy and space to do their work has become a bit of an equity issue. Flex space is an interesting option to offer them when they don't want to take a long commute. They want the same shared experience, but they're not getting that in the home environment. So shying away from those conversations isn't doing anybody any good. You also see women leaving the workforce in record numbers for reasons on the surface that may seem inherent, but are a little more complicated on the back end, because they're middle-aged women that are leaving the workforce, not women with young children, which is what we originally had thought when the data was coming in. So it's a complicated bit, but that listening system involving employees in the solution rather than putting it on them is often a better way forward. We find that those feedback loops are really powerful, get you to a better situation and more equitable types of policies and protocols than trying to figure out in a back room and put it out as a policy to the organization. That tends to fail or doesn't have the right voices in the process.
I'm curious.
Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And PSEG has been a fantastic partner for TechUnited, and their CEO has joined our board. And I've often used them as an example where I've seen a culture shift. Where they used to, it just was culturally required that if you booked a meeting, you'd go meet them in their New York office, and there was a certain formality to it. And because of the pandemic, I think they've all, and I'm sure this is a metaphor for many large organizations, many of them are very comfortable now on Zoom and other platforms, and in some cases really embrace it, and I think appreciate the many benefits that some of us see, and also probably frustrated with some of the lack of being in person. But I think that's an interesting example where many thousands of employees, and they, at scale, how does an organization like that, how would they work with CBRE to say, okay, well, we're interested in making some changes, but these changes have massive implications? Because it's sort of the opposite of the growing startup, where it's a little easier, I think, to make some mistakes. But if you're a large corporation, I guess, one, how would you work them through the process? And two, I would imagine that there are some tough conversations that come up when it comes to equity, where they may come from a mindset of thinking it's their job to provide an equitable work environment that is physical in one location. And the sort of balance between like, what is the corporate responsibility and how much should they invest in making sure every employee in his or her own remote location has a similar experience, sounds like it could get very expensive. And so I'm curious, kind of those things seem tied together. I'm going to let Christelle go first, and then we'll kind of go around. I'm
going to let Su-Zette. That's her.
Okay. I saw a lot of, maybe you're just into it. I had a lot of head nodding. Usually means somebody's ready to go.
Nope.
I'm Su-Zette's biggest fan.
If you had one point of intervention and you needed to prioritize an investment to actually take that friction out, I would look at the meeting culture of the organization, because it's a lever where you can hit an 80-20 type of equitable scenario. If I want to have a shared experience and we're all having that experience together, which is important for productivity and dollars at the end of the day, you could approach it from the way we choose to meet together. So for example, if we're going to have a meeting, Aaron, and it's a town hall, it's a team meeting, everybody's virtual. You don't have a group off in one room attending, and a group in another room in another building attending, and a couple of onesie twosies attending. You're all in your box on a platform like this, where everybody's having the same experience. And we've actually found collaboration can increase when everybody's having that same shared experience. Alternatively, you could choose to have them all in one location to do that sort of thing. Also, time of day, one-on-ones and pulse checks with your teams and with your people in terms of what's the best time to have those kinds of gatherings, meetings, whether it's for collaboration, ideation, problem solving, whatever that purpose is, and adjusting. Right? For some parents, an early morning meeting may not be conducive when they're trying to get kids out to school. And evening later in the day might not be conducive to those who have soccer games or maybe continuing their education for some of our younger folks. A midday meeting might make more sense. There are little tweaks like that that can actually be really impactful that we overlook. But meeting culture is one of the biggest culprits in terms of how people feel they belong within a certain company or corporate culture. You want to be included in those types of meetings when there's more than one person. And that would be a suggestion I have. If you're trying to prioritize your investment, otherwise it could get as big as the ocean, but that would be someplace I would pay special attention. And I think you'd be surprised at the results you would get.
That's a really fascinating point, because I could see a scenario even on a relatively small team where half the team may be in person and half the team is remote. We decide, well, let's get the X, Y, whatever. Let's put 5 of us in the room and the other probably virtual, but you are obviously, that is not the same experience for everyone. I could see that leading to some frustration though, where people would say, well, why did I bother coming in if we're doing half the stuff remotely anyway? And I'm wondering how that affects the physical design of the space. And if there's technology investments that you're seeing organizations made, do you think there's a startup opportunity even for organizations to level the playing field a bit here? But I'm wondering how you think that actually affects the space.
If there's anyone listening, please disrupt the AV and the technology solutions we're seeing in conference rooms. Right now, it's kind of a 2.0. You see some burgeoning ideas around and innovations around what this might look like. But having that kind of experience in an office where you are bringing the virtual in and everybody's getting a similar experience is what everybody is talking about and trying to solve for. And we're not quite there. We're in sort of a 2.0, almost just a step beyond, right? The digital whiteboards that we used to use and then put in closets and never use again. So the idea is that when I'm there, how am I bringing you into the room with me when you're virtual? And what does that look like, not just in the conference rooms, but possibly in your social spaces, at your personal desk? That is a huge opportunity that we're seeing, and a lot of appetite for investment in that space. So I'd encourage anyone, call me if if you want to look down that rabbit hole, I think it's really interesting. The other is through protocols and processes. We do see some folks and some organizations going through a scheduling exercise of when people are in or out of the office. I think that can become cumbersome over time, and it takes the agility out of the way that you're working. So you're better served investing and finding technology that reduces the friction and makes it feel more inclusive. There's nothing worse than being on a phone call. I'm trying to say,
yeah.
Can everybody hear me on the phone? Right, that kind of situation. That's so frustrating, and it doesn't feel inclusive at all. So this one particular bit, I think technology is actually the way forward. If you can get the protocols and the meeting culture moving in another direction, that way everybody doesn't feel like I have to be in or out at the same time. But in the meantime, I think addressing some of those earlier suggestions, at least in the short term, kind of reduces that friction.
So side tidbits, my team is experimenting right now with this Oculus glasses. So they all got the thing, and they're doing those virtual meeting. I joined them once and I thought I would throw up. Like, it's just the weirdest experience ever, but they're loving it. They're like, they're in their own little virtual room with a view on the sea, and they're sitting looking to the whiteboard and drawing, and they're loving it.
I mean, that's a great segue to what I was going to ask you about the future of the workplace. Like, could you imagine a time where CBRE offers like, we have these physical spaces and we can sell you these headsets and we've got all the IT behind it to make it all work? I mean, is that where we're going?
I think personally, the future is digital. And it starts with, we're starting to see some of those solutions, but they're just continue expanding, where in the morning, you're going to interact with your office with your app and with your phone in the morning, right? Hey, where am I going today? Oh, kind of like those social networking elements you have in Snapchat and other functions. Oh, where is Aaron? Oh, you know what? I'm going to book a space next to him. I'm going to go to the office because I want to see, right? Thinking about the office as a place where it's not where you work, is where you go and interact with your people, where you make things happen. So how can we enable that? How can we give them information at the fingertip, the same way we deal with Uber or ordering food or anything? Like, real estate at your fingertips is going to be one of the things, all of it tech enabled. So to all your members out there, we're takers of all ideas and anything that to take our dinosaur real estate industry to the 21st century.
It's really fascinating to hear where you see this industry going, and obviously an industry that's massively effective. I mean, David, I want to be clear, like right now, as people are, if they are uncertain, or even if they are certain, like when should they call you? What should their needs be? When is it a fit for them to reach out and say, okay, we're trying to evaluate what to do next? We're either high growth, big corporate, et cetera. When should they call you?
Yeah, no, I think the whole point of today, why I included Christelle and Su-Zette is probably now, when you're at least knowing what you're doing, is probably the time we should start talking, because there's so many variables at play. And that's why I didn't want to come on this presentation and this discussion, this podcast, by myself, because there's all these interplays going on around workplace right now. It's not just about office space. So the answer is now, and the answer is to discuss where we're going, as an organization, and going through those questions. And then we can help you, solution that, right? Figure out what makes sense.
It seems like you talk about workplace. I think Su-Zette mentioned the term experience before. It's a term we lean into a bit, but it seems like this is the future of the work experience, not necessarily the physical location and the real estate.
Exactly.
Yep.
Obviously, we're champions of the New Jersey region. We see a very obviously complementary relationship with New York, but I know you see things around the globe. And San Francisco, interestingly, right, has seen a huge change in the tech space, but still leading into the tech. As per your own report, they're still leading in the tech talent space. But what are you seeing because of the change of the physical space and the requirements to have people in the same physical location? Where do you think we are going as a society, as a work culture? Do you think, I've got little kids at home, it's less easy to be flexible and just get them out of school and move wherever? I have other people, like I was talking to a guy yesterday who was in Tulum for 6 months and nobody knew the difference. Like, where do you think the world is going when it comes to work?
I'm not sure if core hours are going to be a thing going forward, what we think of as core hours. That kind of flexibility and being on a different kind of clock, I think be really interesting and powerful. We're already starting to see that out of the pandemic as we all adjusted schedules. The danger of that is balance and what that looks like. So I think work and life risks, the beauty of these is it could risk being more integrated, a little bit more congruent. But I also think companies are being more thoughtful about the brands they're putting out in the market and what that means for them internally. So if I have a brand that's facing out and we're not feeling it internally, right? The clients get the best of who we are, but internally we're not really operating. That disconnect is actively trying to be solved because it's become more apparent in the last year as we more closely examine the brands, what we buy, who we talk about, who we go work for. And that has been a surprising, but I think brand and culture are going to be more tightly aligned as we go forward, both for the employee experience and the client experience.
Interesting. Christelle, what do you think? Where are we going?
I think even though people saying, oh, the office is like dwindling down, I don't think the office is dead. I think it's going to be a really key important cornerstone of a company and how people work. I think the environment in it and in the experience in it is really massively going to change as we evolve. Like, we're social creatures, right? And we love collaborating. We like the best ideas comes from people bump into each other, and we're going to need to recreate that. And there's so much that technology can do. The tools can enable people to create those moments where we bump into each other and the ideas and the creativity is there. But I think the office will still be there. It'll look a little different. It'll probably be a little bit more dispersed. It will definitely look different. But I think we'll value a little bit more people's connectivity and connections, what they create together, and we'll capitalize on that.
David, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question in the same vein, which is, do you think that, I'm trying to think of the metric here, but whatever the world's top 10 tech companies will be in the next decade and beyond, will be majority remote or majority in person?
Well, I mean, it's funny because I hate to. I'm not a great guy, but it's probably somewhere in between. At least that seems how it feels today. I hate to give you that answer, but I will say this. I think what everyone said. I don't think that these companies at the end of the day are going to have significantly less office space. I think it's just going to be used differently, and I think that's what we're starting to see. I mean, that's the reality.
That's a really great point. That's a really great point. Well, obviously, there's a fantastic team at CBRE who can help people listening navigate some of these things. I really appreciate you joining us. Is there anything that we didn't touch on? Because I think people, when they dig deeper on the services you provide, may have a much better understanding of how sort of holistic the approach is on work overall, not just real estate. But so is there anything else you think that people should know about that we didn't get a chance to touch on? If I'm getting no's, that's a good sign.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate the three of you joining us. We really appreciate CBRE's partnership with TechUnited. I know we'll be doing more together and psyched to have that happen. And I'll try to make less jabs about the Jersey thing, because the technology in this case has obviously broadened our opportunity to serve people really around the world, which we've seen happen. We just have a little bit of the Springsteen Jersey pride thing happening. So normally if we're in person, we do a lot of high-fiving. We haven't done that in person in a while. But on the count of three, high five your camera with me. 1, 2, 3, boom. Thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for listening, watching, reading, however you're consuming this. And we'll see you soon with TechUnited. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.